Kalawalia, the digital strategist at Progress Texas, and welcome to our happy hour. Today I'm joined by Ed Espinosa, Diana Gomez, and Wesley Story. It has been a big week. Yesterday, 666. 666. I think that's the mark of the beast. That many laws went into effect. And today we're going to talk about a few of them that were really bad for Texans and maybe how we can do things to turn the tide. This has been a rough week, and this is a happy hour. So why don't we quickly go around the horn and say, what is everyone drinking during this happy hour? I'll go first. I'm having a White Russian, which is keeping me cool, but also keeping me high at like getting over this freaking September 1st. Diana, what do you got in your cup?
Since it has been a hell of a week with 666 new laws in Texas, I have a white wine.
Ooh, white. Very, very classy.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Wesley?
Mm-hmm.
So not only has it been a hell of a week, it's been a hell of a month, a hell of a year, a hell of a decade. So I have a big glass of sparkling white wine. It looks very similar to Diana's as well.
And what about you, Ed?
So kind of a spoiler here. I got a Maine root beer. So it's not alcoholic, although I'm not far behind you all on the alcoholic part. It's just what I happen to have open here at lunch today, but still some good stuff. It's kind of a beer.
So you know what? I think your drink is like aspirational because Maine has less repressive abortion laws than Texas. So
I don't know, man. They still got Susan Collins. Susan Collins put a lot of us in this mess. As I put on Twitter,
For real.
I wonder if she's still optimistic about Brett Kavanaugh. But anyway.
So speaking of abortion, Diana, yesterday a big law went into effect, which is not great for a lot of Texans. Do you want to give us like the 411 on what exactly was in that?
Yeah, I'll give a quick breakdown. I know we have, not only been informing folks about this new law that was, supposed to start yesterday, hoping that it wouldn't, but it did. But a quick breakdown is that it is Texas's new 6-week abortion ban that also creates bounty hunters. And what that means is that, basically laws like this have been proposed in states across the country, but every single one of them have been overturned in federal courts. Why? Because they're unconstitutional, just like this one. This is the very first law of its kind to be enacted, to have taken effect in the entire nation here in Texas. It bans abortions at 6 weeks before many people even know that they are pregnant. And then besides that, like I said, it creates abortion bounty hunters, which means that anyone outside of the state of Texas and in Texas can sue anyone who helps someone attain an abortion.
And Diana, tell the thing about that $10,000 bounty, like, who pays that?
That is a great question. I mean, I think, assume since it's like a civil suit, it would be up to that person, that entity, that organization to have to pay for it. And it really puts a lot of organizations in a bind, a lot of advocacy organizations, especially lots of abortion funds, folks that have been out there as a support group. Before yesterday, it was already difficult to attain an abortion in Texas, even though Roe versus Wade has always been the law of the land, still is the law of the land. What Texas has done is that it's done a really terrible job, right, at making sure that Texans could access abortion by making it really inaccessible and creating a lot of barriers. This is another one, assuming that it'll be up to individuals and organizations to pay those fees, but it's still up to my guests to see, where all that money is going to come from.
I just want to give a shout out to Diana real fast because it has been a crazy 24 hours. And yesterday obviously was a huge day with this law going into effect. She's been doing interview after interview with media. And one of the questions that she's constantly being asked that we actually talked about yesterday, it's her least favorite question, is what's next? Where do we go from here? And so I'm going to be the bad guy here, Diana, and ask you what's next? Where do we go from here? But also I want to ask you, why do you hate that question so much?
I hate that question because I'm going to be honest in two ways. One way is I hate the question because then I have to pause and really think hard about what I'm going to say. And I have to do that because we are, not one of those organizations that, is super on the front lines in terms of being, those doctors, those nurses, those abortion funds, really helping directly provide those abortions. But we are an advocacy organization. We have provided resources before. And now we are in the crosshairs of this new law. And it makes me mad because now, this is part of what the anti-abortion vigilantes want, is to scare people into thinking that they can't attain abortions and to scare their communities into thinking that they can't help them, or else they will be
can't talk about it.
Or that they can't talk about it. Yeah, because it really creates this gray area. What is freedom of speech and what is actually aiding and abetting? And not just that, but there's a part of this law that says, you can't help someone get it, but you can't even intend to. What does that mean? There's so much gray area in this. Like, if I just it's like a pre-crime. I was talking about earlier, that movie Minority Report. Are we living in a Minority Report movie now with pre-crimes? And now these vigilante citizens are going to crash through my window and, I don't know, grab me and force me to pay them $10,000 on the spot or something.
When you see those signs that say, don't even think about parking here. Well, if that were the case, you'd actually get a ticket for it now, even if you did think about it.
Don't even think about abortion or we'll sue you.
What I'm kind of hoping is that these antis are so dumb, they can't figure out how to make this work. I saw Mike Siegel posted on Instagram that someone called his wife and said, "Hey, I'm suing your husband." I don't think that's how you sue someone. And hopefully they don't figure out how to do it, right? Because they're not that smart.
I mean, if Texas really has succeeded in dumbing down its education system as much as it has and wants to continue doing that, people might never figure out how to actually file a lawsuit and how to go through with this.
Well, hopefully.
Actually, I have one question for you. Oh, go ahead. Ed, you first, please.
I was going to say, hopefully, some people do figure out how to properly file lawsuits on this. I know that there have been some proactive lawsuits on behalf of Whole Women's Health to try and stop this. The Supreme Court didn't help. I do hope that some people figure out that the fact that this is a very flawed law on every level and find a way to defeat it so that the constitutional right to abortion access and a right to an abortion is upheld. But I worry that that's going to be a longer process in front of us. So for the question of what's next, hopefully that's something that comes next. But I'm not a lawyer. I'm not part of that process yet, as far as I know. But we'll have to see how it plays out. Sorry, Safik, back to you.
No problem. So, Dana, I have a question before we get into other terrible laws that were passed on the first. But if you were sitting in front of Greg Abbott right now and you had 30 seconds, what would you say to his face?
Oh, man, I would say all the terrible words I probably couldn't say on the podcast. I would say, post up, son. Let's roll. Let's go. Let's do this. I don't know.
Oh, man. I would honestly, I probably wouldn't even ask him a question. To answer the question you asked Diana, if I were in that position, I would probably just speak truth to power and be like, you don't speak for the overwhelming majority of people in your state.
No.
And
he probably knows it. I'm sure he knows it. I just don't
care. Yeah.
I would ask him why he hates Texans. What did we do to make you hate us so much? And not even just the people on the other side of the aisle. The laws that he's put into effect and his failures affect everybody in our state. And so why are you the governor of a state that you clearly do not care about?
I mean, definitely,
before we move on. Go ahead.
Or I was going to say, with the theme of 666 laws that were passed, I would ask him, how did you make this deal with the devil?
Or are you the devil?
Are you? Yeah, that's a great question.
The devil came going to Texas,
Are you Satan in disguise?
It's gonna be like the end of one of those Scooby-Doo cartoon episodes. Have you been the devil all along and take off?
It's the unmasking of Greg Abbott.
Yeah.
Ed, you said you wanted to add something. You said
just before we move on from this subject, think about how much their approach to healthcare and this issue makes no sense, right? They're against any kind of abortion. They're trying to outlaw medication abortion right now. They're also against full day pre-K for once people have a child. They are also against expanding Medicaid or any kind of access to affordable care. They are also against sex education in schools. They teach abstinence education, which doesn't make any sense. And when you look at the inconsistencies that this is all put together, like it is, what are they trying to do? Like, what era are we trying to go back to with these laws? It's not an era that I want to be a part of. And it's not an era that the majority of Texans wants to be a part of either. But even separate from that, all of these things taken individually and as a whole, their policies make no sense. That's my soapbox.
No, I mean, it's a good soapbox. It's the best soap. We want you to scrub the governor clean of Greg Abbott. So on one hand, we had a bill that banned an essential right for I read 7 million Texans are, this got canceled. On the flip side, Wesley, now you don't need any kind of restrictions to have a gun. Do you want to talk a little bit about what permitless carry entails?
Yeah, so permitless carry, or House Bill 1927, as it's otherwise known, is another law that went into effect yesterday. And specifically, it allows Texans 21 and older to openly carry handguns without a license or training. So what this means is you no longer need a license to carry a gun in Texas, but you still need one to vote. And like Ed was saying, most Texans are against the law pertaining to abortion. A vast majority of Texans are against this law as well. A majority of Texans oppose permitless carry, and most Texans actually support common sense gun safety reform. But instead of focusing on passing legislation that would help Texans in gun violence in our state, Republicans were busy making our state more dangerous with this ridiculous law. So I think it's important to also know that during the legislative session and even till today, many law enforcement officers have spoken out against this legislation. Republicans are supposedly the politicians who campaign on backing the blue, but they went against law enforcement to get this unpopular bill passed.
And that's a really excellent point, Wesley, because I know that you and Diana spent a lot of time at the Capitol this session and during the endless special sessions that we're having this year. But didn't police from different cities in Austin, in Texas, show up to Austin to ask them not to do this? Like, I'm trying to remember which police departments were there, but the number was pretty varied, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think police officers from across the state showed up to testify against this legislation. I can't name all of the different cities. I'm assuming many of the big cities like Austin, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, but even some of the smaller cities and counties as well. And the reason for that is this adds just another element to local law enforcement officers. More guns in the hands of Texans means that people are less safe. At the end of the day, more guns does not make people safer. It leads to an increased risk of gun violence.
Who's the group of people who cannot get guns? If you're a felon, I think if you have a felony conviction, you cannot carry a firearm. I think one of the cases the cops made was that if you're removing the permit process, if you're removing the paperwork process, how do you verify if a convicted felon is going to try to obtain a weapon? And I don't recall there ever being an answer for that. I think the answer was the honor system. If I'm recalling correctly?
I wouldn't doubt that was their solution, Ed, because that seems to fit with just their general overall stupidity on these laws. But I will say also, obviously, if you're under 21, you shouldn't be allowed to buy one. And then, yes, you're right, formerly incarcerated folks. And I think that there are specifics in regards to what they were incarcerated for, whether or not they're eligible to obtain a firearm. But yeah, I think that this law, again, is not well thought out. There's definitely going to be some kind of litigation surrounding it, but we're still awaiting what that'll look like.
And Wesley, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm not sure if you remember this, but I think there was an attempt to add an amendment to this bill to make it so that there would be an exception in schools. And I believe that amendment failed. And I remember a lot of especially on the Democrat side, legislators arguing, some of them to tears, with children, talking about, please, let's make an exception for schools and not like allow that to be an open carry space. But, just repeating, like you said before, is that they might have not really thought this through when it came to how dangerous this is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that Texas has a history of gun violence. This is a huge nationwide epidemic, but specifically here in Texas, El Paso, Sunderland Springs, too many Texans have faced gun violence in their homes, in schools, in churches, and just in general in community spaces. But for some reason, Republicans have made promises in the past. When they were campaigning in 2020, Dan Patrick talked about passing some common gun reform legislation. And then in this 2021 legislative session, they went back on their word. They lied to Texans about what they were going to get done, and now they're making it easier to get firearms.
Yeah. If you remember right after the El Paso shootings, and like you mentioned, Wesley, after the Sutherland Springs and Santa Fe Springs shootings, Abbott did these roundtables around the state where he went, he listened to people, and he talked about things that he would be in favor of: red flag laws, potentially background checks, other things that he was up for consideration. And then when his poll numbers took a dive amongst his conservative base, all bets were off. He needed to consolidate his conservative base so that he could protect his politics and his reelection. Not anything to do with Texans or the people who died or the family members who were victims of gun violence, but everything to do with the conservative base. Greg Abbott doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about Texas. He cares about his politics. And it's unfortunate that after all the violence we've seen in this state, we have lawmakers who continue to do nothing about it. Literally will do nothing about the gun violence.
And it's all just, like you said, for political gain to keep themselves in office. And I think another important thing to talk about, we already said a vast majority of Texans oppose this law, but also half of Republican women also oppose this law. So it's not even just on the left, it's people on their own side who are also against this legislation. But instead, they're pandering to this really small, extreme far-right base, this small constituency, in order to get the votes to keep themselves in office.
I think it's like you were saying.
I think it's important to note that, like, really, from my perspective, the only person Abbott's competing with is Ron DeSantis. Right?
Sure.
They're both saying, how can we go even crazier? Because in 2024, I want to replace Biden in the White House. And their only path to do it: anti-science, anti-woman, anti-voters, anti-everything, anti-life. And speaking of voting, Wesley, I just wanted to, I haven't followed the voting rights as closely as you have, but how does permitless carry mix with partisan poll watchers? Can they bring guns into the voting booth area?
That's a really good question, Satvik, and that's something that we've also been having conversations about, and this also kind of ties into the abortion conversation we're having, because it's this theme of promoting this vigilantism. And that's what's happening. The most recent law that was passed empowers partisan poll watchers, gives them special rights at the polls. And now when you mix in permitless carry, they could potentially be armed, which adds a whole other layer of intimidation. Partisan poll watchers have a history of harassing and intimidating people of color at the polls, trying to get it to where they don't vote. They're scared to even show up at the polling places in the first place. Yeah. And now they could potentially be armed and not even have to have prior training or permits in order to carry a gun.
I moved to Texas 2 years ago, and I'm like, well, do I leave Texas now? Like, this is wild. What kind of education will my daughter get here? And speaking of education, that was a great segue. Speaking of education, our group here is pretty diverse, and we've had amazing, diverse leaders across American history. But you wouldn't know that in school. Ed, why is that? And what is a law that just got passed that relates right back to this?
So Texas has some pretty strict standards when it comes to education and what you can teach in the classroom. And those standards just got a lot stricter with some of the things passed in the legislature. Now, Republicans will call it critical race theory, which, by the way, they never defined. That is a law school term that does not apply to K through 12 classrooms. What we're really talking about here is teaching diversity, the teaching of the history of racism, the teaching of the civil rights movement. These are all things that should be in classrooms. People should learn about this. And too often in Texas, they do not. There's a concerted effort to keep it that way. Teachers are very upset about this. I would gather that students are very upset about this. But Republicans made this a rallying cry last year. Donald Trump amplified it, and now you're seeing it codified in state legislatures now. And that's one of the things that we're facing right now. I mean, look, you've probably heard about the uproars at school board meetings where this tiny minority of very angry white parents will show up completely misinformed on something and making a lot of noise. By the way, these are also people who are anti-maskers. They are also people that are holdovers from the Tea Party. And they're people that sympathize with the January 6th insurrectionists. Their next form of attack is the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ed, is this type of law something that is only happening in Texas and that our Republican legislators wrote themselves?
Unfortunately, it's happening in a lot of states right now, but it's not limited to Texas. It's just the old saying, everything's bigger in Texas.
Yeah.
Including the headaches and the I'm going to say some bad words here, so I won't say it. But I'll be honest with you. I follow a guy on TikTok. His name is Cody Pogue. He's a teacher here in Texas, and he talked a little bit about this. And one of the things he said, he has a class of mostly students of color. And he went around the class and he said, name 10 people in American history. And they would name things like Thomas Jefferson or, George Washington. They named a lot of the founding fathers and presidents and such. And then he came back and he said, name women from history. And then they would say things like Eleanor Roosevelt, Michelle Obama, mostly Jackie Kennedy, mostly presidents' wives. And then when he asked, and they couldn't get to 10, by the way. And then when he asked them about name people of color, they mentioned people like Martin Luther King. Didn't get too much farther than that. Then he said, name specifically, do you know any Mexican Americans or people of Latino heritage? And the students would mention people like Pancho Villa, Santa Anna, like just the bad guys. Cesar Chavez's name didn't come up. You didn't hear any of the other names. You didn't hear Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a disabled American's name come up, because the teaching is not a complete teaching. What we're missing in our classrooms is comprehensive education, a complete education. And the Republican effort to stifle the teaching of diversity is a Republican effort for an incomplete and incomprehensive, non-comprehensive education. And that's what we're facing here. And it is a misservice to our students and to our society.
And you would think that wouldn't be something that's controversial. One thing that we've been saying over and over again is students deserve an education that deals in facts, not folklore. They should be given the tools that they need to succeed in a society, right, and understand the context, under the history, the context by which our society was built, where we're at now, so that we can move forward as a country. None of that really seems controversial to me. So I guess my question is, what do Republicans have to gain by passing this legislation? Why are they doing it? How does it help them?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer for it. But I'll tell you what this stems from, and this may kind of paint a picture here. This issue is not even a year old. It goes back to last fall. there is a conservative documentary filmmaker, an activist named Chris Rufo. Now, Chris Rufo got wind of the Department of Treasury doing a diversity training for its staff members, and one person in that training being very upset about it. Chris Rufo decided to make a big deal out of it, found his way onto Fox News, specifically to get the attention of Donald Trump, since Donald Trump, all he ever did was sit around the White House and watch Fox News all day. And apparently it worked. He talked about why diversity was bad. He talked about why equity and inclusion was bad and why we needed to stop these trainings. And he framed it around the issue of critical race theory. Well, he was right. Donald Trump was watching. And 1 week later, he said that he was going to end diversity training at the Department of Treasury and everywhere else in the federal government. And since that time, the attack on diversity trainings has been framed as this critical race theory message that most people don't understand, and they've taken it to schools. So make what you will of it, interpret that as you may, but that's the origins of this, and that's where it's been running full speed ahead ever since.
I will say, Ed, you forgot one thing about what Trump was doing. He was sitting around watching Fox News all day and eating McDonald's.
Big Macs.
He gave.
Wesley,
do you remember?
Yes.
I think one thing that you gain from this, Wesley, is like you shape a narrative for like a whole generation, right? And like I spend too much time on Reddit, right? I shouldn't do it. But there's like a lot of like really far right people there. And one thing they like to say is that like white folks did all the things that like, we take pride in, like they did it. And so if you're in school and all the great people you learn about are white, then the logical conclusions are that everyone else didn't contribute to like America. And like that's a really dangerous narrative, because then what are we? Like we're like not good enough, right? And I think that's like a really powerful thing that they will gain from if they succeed in all this stuff.
Yeah, I agree, Sophic. Sorry, Diana. I was just going to say, I agree.
Sorry, Wesley. I was also going to say that I agree, but also add that I was someone who, like many of us, or two of us, you and I, Wesley, had a public education here in Texas. And when I initially started school at Brown, and I honestly felt so behind, so behind already, and what my peers had learned from other states. I eventually finished school at UT, but I majored in Mexican American studies. That was the very first time I learned about Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Gloria Anzaldúa, any people of color that had amazing roles in the history of not just our state, but our nation. And I learned about artists and poets and politicians. And the outcome of that was that I felt so inspired and empowered to think that maybe I could do something like that too. And so to take away, especially people of color, women, low-income folks, to take away their history, I think they're trying to do a good job of taking away our power. And that, I think, directly speaks to how powerful we feel is the likelihood that we're going to be civically engaged and vote and participate in democracy, knowing how powerful we are and knowing that we have a voice.
One other thing I'll add really quickly is that this is not new. The way they're doing it in the legislation they're pushing may be new, like the strategy they're using may be new, but Republicans are good at creating moral panics. And this is an ongoing campaign against the liberal education, the East Coast elites that they've been pushing for a really long time. They're just finding a new way to frame it. And it's something that gives them something to rally around, to build up their base around. So I think that's something important to keep in mind too, is that this is not new. This is an attack on education that's been happening, been something that Republicans have been taking part in for a really long time.
That's an excellent way to phrase it. Republicans are good at creating moral panics. And it's an important phrasing to remember because they're so morally corrupt. They don't have any moral ground to stand on. And they don't care.
It's all deflection.
Yeah. You know, Wesley, you mentioned coastal elites. And if there are any Republicans, Greg Abbott, Donald Trump listening right now, you know, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. So I am a coastal elite. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
both coastal elites. And let me tell you, we're not coming after you. We love you. We want you to have like a good, thriving life, everyone in Texas. So next time Abbott's like, oh, the coastal, blah, 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 ask us. He is lying. We're telling you the truth. We just want to make Texas a good place for everyone. We're not going after anything.
I mean, you might be going after Abbott a little bit.
Yeah, but he's not really Texans. He's like, if we talked about it, he's like the devil basically who's hiding as Abbott. We're going to pull the mask off, right?
Yes.
And of course,
Accurate.
the people saying that are people with more money in their bank accounts than we could ever dream of having.
Honestly.
So,
Yeah, right.
Yes.
They're the only ones who can afford homes on the coastal
Right.
coast right now.
I cannot afford a home in Boston.
Me either. That's why I'm here. Can't afford one here either. But that's a story for a different podcast.
Well, we covered a lot today, and I noticed right now that my glass is empty, and I'm guessing a lot of yours are too. And maybe we need to have like an actual happy hour right after this podcast is over. So I'm going to close it out. Wesley, Dana, Ed, thank you as always for lending your expertise. To everyone who's watching and listening, thanks for joining us. Head over to www.progresstexas.org to follow us on social and subscribe to our email list. If you're listening to us, subscribe. If you're listening to us on a podcast, subscribe, and please leave a review so that everyone else can learn about how great our podcast is. And then soon we'll take over all Texas with this great content. Have an amazing weekend. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.